Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. Today we have a very special guest with us, Antara Vasudev, who's a founder of CIVIS, a civic tech platform. We also have our alum Divya Pinge, who's a senior associate at CIVIS, and my colleague Sowmy and Ritul. I want to start as the monsoon session for Parliament begins. We have a lot of bills tabled, 24 new to be precise. But let's take a step back and try to understand where these bills come from. Try to understand what is the relationship between citizens and the government. Citizens, who are often the direct beneficiaries of government policies, are more often than not excluded from the consultation process. This results in dissent and discontent being expressed to the government on a post facto basis, and laws and policies misaligned with the expectations and experience of citizens. With this backdrop, I want to go to Antara and ask, what is her conception of the relationship between citizens and the government?
Thanks, Ritul, and thanks, Soumya, for having us on this podcast. Very excited to be here. That question is actually really a very interesting one, Ritul. I feel like it has a little bit of a historical perspective as well as some inputs from the way that the internet has changed things. So it's quite interesting to actually trace the origins of this question and go from there. Traditionally, I believe we've had more of a Raja Praja relationship with the state, right? Where one person is the ruler of many. However, this notion actually goes against the fundamental sort of ethos of democracy, which is the ability for us to be able to bring more people into the decision making process, into the, I would say, the Raja section of the relationship, right? However, democracy in practice means that these entitlements, though they are given to us, have still very high barriers of entry. I may not be able to quit my job and put my life on hold while I conduct an election and face the prospect of potentially losing. So the sort of power dynamic has continued over a longer period of time, even though the democratic ethos has been very different. That being said, today, as citizens, we have many superpowers that can actually enable us to engage with the state a lot more effectively. One of these superpowers could be the RTI, another one could be voting, a third one could be very much standing for office. But a fourth and very underutilized but very, very transformative superpower is the ability to actually engage with the state on draft laws and policies. So UNICEF and a number of different other different organizations have done research which shows that today, in a technology-enabled world, young people are more keen to actually engage with the state on a proactive basis, not just once in 5 years, but every day. They want to have personalized engagement with the state and they want to be involved in the process far beyond voting. Now, today, the equation is changed, and it's such that we have one institution which is set to govern and another polity which is actually keen to be involved in the governance processes. So, we need to create that infrastructure to be able to allow the two to meet in between. And I think that's where the changing nature of the relationship really does arise.
Thank you so much for this. I want to understand that the idea, the relationship between the citizen and government is one of evolution, and and we've seen how 73rd and 74th Amendment actually took democracy to deeper and to the grassroots level, wherein we sort of formalized it in the constitutional sense. But where I want to learn from you is that how do you think tech has sort of come in and changed this landscape? I mean, this is where you guys work and you're passionate about the dialogue between citizens and the and government through the use of tech. So, what is the landscape of tech changing that relationship? Be it online dispute resolution, be it participative legislation. What is it that? What are your thoughts on this?
Thanks, Ritul. So I'll just give a sort of broad overview, and then perhaps Divya can come in on this since she is the resident manager of all things tech at CIVIS. One funny anecdote, the way that I think about democracy as evolution, right, you know how with our grandparents, we always thought our grandparents had gray hair because we never thought that they could change in any way. To our minds, they're sort of immortalized the way that we saw them when we were children and grew up. And that's, I feel like, the same way we look at democracy sometimes. Ki it's as old as time, so it's just going to be the same that it has always been. But interestingly, tech actually does come in and play a very transformative role because you're able to augment processes that you weren't able to do earlier, right? If we look at technology as old as the printing press, there when Gutenberg's press actually came up and there was a much more free flow of information from one source to others, that technology played a pivotal role in building awareness. Today we have the ability for technology to enhance, and I say this knowing fully well that technology is not a silver spoon, and I don't want to give off that idea, but technology helps us optimize processes for us to be able to engage more with the state. So we're going from Gutenberg's press, which is like one-way communication and broadcasts, to social media, online dispute resolution, and a number of these different technological interventions that are actually focusing on two-way street of dialogue. Divya, do you want to share some of your thoughts on this as well?
Yes, Antara, thank you. Thanks, Ritul. Thanks, Soumya, for having us today. Antara has already placed a very interesting base of how technology plays a role in enabling or revolutionizing democracy as the way we see it is. So that, like she mentioned, there are certain things in a democratic system which will remain constant, which is basically the exchange or just the conversations between citizens and government. And there are certain things which need to be kind of amped up, keeping in with the times. This is where we see technology coming in. Now, through our interactions with citizens, through our interactions with government departments, government officials, think tanks who work in this space, there is one thing that we have kind of identified or understood is that there is a lot of interest for citizens to want to express themselves to the government. And there is a lot of interest in the governments wanting to understand what citizens have to say when it comes to making laws. Where a little bit of constraint lies, or where we see technology really coming in, is enabling this process from a capacity building perspective. Government departments or just the entire system does not have the adequate capacity to be really able to streamline a lot of processes that exist for them to be able to share a policy with the whole of India, get their feedback on it, learn, process it, and then see where they can actually implement it in the lawmaking process. Likewise, from a citizen's perspective, if I'm sitting at in a remote town in India, I'm really not sure how do I go about even communicating my point in a constructive, in a productive manner with the government. A lot of these processes are where we see technology coming in as a way to make things happen in a faster and a more efficient, effective manner. This is the role of technology as we see it. Like Antara said, it's not a silver bullet. It's not the only answer or the only solution to everything that we're trying to solve for, but it's a major enabler, be it through social media or through the technology interventions that CIVIS is working on, that we see this entire process can be streamlined and made a lot more effective than what it already is.
Thank you so much. That's a interesting note to sort of let me pick the next thread from here, which is that both the need for government interaction with the citizens and the role of tech. And the first thing that I can think of is Twitter. I mean, that sort of changed the way we looked at government. You could directly interact with a verified government handle and then put your grievance out there, and the government could even respond. And you had bureaucrats joining in, so you could directly respond to your bureaucrat, and then the bureaucrat responds. So but then I also understand that there are limitations to it, that is that it is not in a structured form, it is disaggregated, and also like it is exclusionary in the sense that only people with access to these things could make use of the platform. So knowing these constraints, how did you guys start Civis? What is the idea behind Civis? And to begin with, what is Civis? So could you guys throw some more light on that?
Sure, happy to. Interesting that you mentioned Twitter. So we can always chat about Twitter as well because I really love how it is utilized to support government's efforts. But Civis as a platform actually looked at one of the superpowers that we spoke about earlier, which is the pre-legislative consultation policy. So what this mouthful means is that I, as a citizen, starting from 2014, could make my voice heard and share my feedback on any law or policy that the government puts forth, right? Now, this is quite transformative because it's a direct ability and a direct channel to reach out to a government body and share your feedback on a draft law policy. To properly utilize this process, we saw that there were many challenges that came out. One is that citizens are often unaware of which policies are seeking their feedback, right? You and I are not, or maybe we are, but maybe everyone is not well versed with searching the Gazette or going to corners of government websites and figuring out, okay, which consultation, which law can I share my feedback on? The second challenge is that even if I do find a consultation, chances are that it's written in complicated legalese and I may not actually understand what the consultation is saying. The third challenge, like you mentioned, Ritul, is one of exclusivity and inclusivity, right? In spirit, democracies are made for everyone and our laws are made for every citizen. So, actually enabling every citizen to come in and share their feedback is a challenge. And lastly, supporting the government is also equally important because it can't just be that, okay, we take this feedback, we sort of pass it on to them, and then that's the end of the story. Governments also have a lot of capacity constraints in being able to understand, make sense of, analyze feedback at large volumes, right? Lakhs and lakhs of feedback points sent on a particular law. How do they make sense of it, right? So Civis actually works at the intersection of those four problems. And I'll perhaps leave it to Divya to tell you a little bit more about exactly how we work on those intersections. Divya?
Sure, thanks, Antara. To elaborate a little on each of these aspects that we are working on, Ritul, so one constraint that is there with the general process to do with public consultation is just the accessibility or just the awareness of knowing that there is a particular draft law which is out published by the government for feedback and on which I can give my feedback as well. To be honest, I was also not aware of this before I came to know about Civis. So, what we start off by doing is by aggregating all of these draft laws, which are published on different government platforms. Some of them might be in the Gazette, some of them might be on individual government websites. Different ministries put out at different times the draft laws that they're working on. We start off by aggregating all of these laws together and identifying the ones which are currently open for feedback and the ones that we can publish on Civis's platform at one common place, so that anyone visiting Civis's website will be able to see all of them together at one glance. The next step is, like Antara mentioned, simplifying these laws for the consumption and the understanding of a layperson. There is a lot of legalese in the manner that the content has drafted. It's not something which a person without a legal background may be accustomed or comfortable to reading. So we are supported by a team of law students who volunteer with us, who work on reading the law and identifying those aspects which can be put out in a very short summary, enough for anyone to understand what is it that the government has proposed, and just enough for them to be able to form an opinion or share their thoughts on it. This is a manual process that we do, and we thereafter follow it up by translating that summary into local languages so that it becomes accessible to as many people as possible. So there's something which you can read in Hindi as well. The summary can be read in Hindi too. And you can then thereafter write your feedback so that no one feels constrained just by having to read an English document. This is where we have a mix of human effort as well as technology coming in. Having done this process on the website, we publish these draft laws along with their summaries and follow it up by a structured process of reaching out to citizens, informing them that this is something which is out there for feedback. You can go read and comment on it. And usually these draft laws are open for a time period of 21 to 30 days. That's when everybody can come and respond on them. Every people can come to Civis's platform, read the draft law and submit their responses on it. These responses can again be simple answers to a question that has been given, or just a very detailed opinion of what you really think the draft law is talking about. One thing that we are very cognizant of is about making the draft law and its summary accessible to citizens in its complete spirit and form, without adding our layer of understanding to it, so that the kind of feedback that comes into the government is nuanced and is comprehensive and takes into consideration different aspects, not to lead a particular line of thought. Once the deadline has consultation is over, all the responses are collated and then emailed to prepare a report, and that is thereafter shared with the respective government department. So at each stage, as we see, there is a little bit of mix of how technology is supporting the process, as well as how people are coming in, and there's like a very symbiotic kind of a relationship, and they're working in tandem. So once the feedback is made through to the government, at that point we also track to see whether how much of it has been read, and if government departments are responding to us in any way, because citizens very much want to know what has happened to the feedback once they've given it. Each of these stages we have like a technology intervention that we are trying to build and improvise as we go along, to see how the entire process can be made more structured and streamlined.
Thank you, Divya, for this. I think that's a good time to take a break.
Okay, so as an extension to where we were, while we are focusing on the premise of Samaj and Sarkar, right, predominantly, while there is policy consultation that's coming, which is an active thing that CIVIS does, and you also prioritize what the government should probably look at. I also feel a lot of times citizens value the fact that there are here and now problems, which if you create some noise and challenge the status quo and write about it, it creates that attention that the government needs to look at it on priority, right? So does that influence what happens at the service platform, or it's surely driven by how the environment is looking?
Thanks, Soumya. If I can just answer to that. So, like we mentioned, the kind of feedback that we get from citizens is of different nature. There are a lot of times that we come and we see feedback coming in saying this is great, with a thumbs up. And at times people will write like a extremely detailed and a very legal, technical opinion that they have formed based on the draft that they've read. So each and every form of feedback is relevant to be passed on to the government. This is because what can be critique for someone may not be for the other. So in terms of how the platform sees itself is to be able to aggregate all these different nature of feedback coming in from citizens of different backgrounds and different demographics, and give a very constructive and a very action oriented kind of an overview to the eventual government official who wants to implement this feedback into action. So the whole aspect of the way the platform sees itself is quite neutral in nature. Does that answer the question?
That does, but it also leads into this question saying, okay, you have a leaderboard there, right? I'm thinking it's more for encouraging individuals to have those scores and see your participation levels. But does that in any way contribute to, improving the participation rates, or looking at people in that network, giving more of inputs?
Right. It's interesting that you mention the leaderboard. I'll just give a little bit of a idea of what this is all about. So the leaderboard, like you rightly mentioned, is basically it's a board that just shows the participation of different citizens who have come into the platform and engaged in different activities. It's a way of encouragement, and it's also a way of acknowledging their effort. Because a lot of times what happens is even if we take our individual examples, when we give feedback to someone, we do seek an instant acknowledgement or a gratification for it. Now what happens with the entire policy making or just the law making process is that it's oftentimes almost impossible for someone to give a feedback and see it implemented the very next day,
Yeah.
or for them to get like a response to it the very next day. It's a long drawn process, and rightly so. In such a situation, what we attempt to do is acknowledge the effort that one person has put in. It might be over just upvoting somebody's response, or it could be writing a one liner that says I really agree with what the government has said, but it's important to gratify and acknowledge that effort. The leaderboard does that to a large extent, and through our conversations with different citizens, we've also come to understand that it's a very fun thing for them to just see their name being there. So yes, it is a means to encourage participation, and it's not broken down in terms of what is the participation that you have done. It's basically just an aggregation of the different ways the platform and the citizens speak to each other.
Thank you, Divya. I want to make a few interjections here. One, going back on the one trying to understand the evolution of the pre-legislative consultation policy, I read that it mandates that a draft version of it to be placed in public domain for at least 30 days. And then the respective department should also upload the summary of all the feedback that they've received on circulated draft. I was on LinkedIn. I found yesterday that a former colleague of mine, Debadityo Sinha, which you both know as well, he's an environmental researcher. He had put out that Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change had released proposed amendment to four legislation, namely Water Act, EPA 1986, etc. And the time given is just 20 days. And in something which is an Indian Forest Act, which is quite a consequential act, the time given is just 15 days. So getting back to a more important question is that how receptive the government is for feedback, and just in terms of how has the evolution of policy been. Now this is to Divya and Antara, and to Soumya, who I think is probably a recurring winner of a Citizen of JP Nagar award. Soumya, what has your experience been in terms of interacting with the government? Because both at Takshashila, in Bangalore, and in your area, you're an active citizen. So as I understand that there's a loop of three key players, which is one is the citizen, the second is the government, and in middle is where we see CIVIS, who's trying to translate sort of things for each other. So what has your experience, and then probably Divya and Antara can chime in and say the receptivity of and the evolution of the policy.
Yeah, and in the thanks Ritul for that question, and I think it ties in well that entire Samaj Sarkar Bazar thinking process, right? So here, at least in the local community, I've realized that the moment you engage directly with the government here, I mean, if I'm talking about small things, right? Like there are senior citizens around the place, they wanted a park just because it's nice to have a chat, and that entire community engagement kinds of builds up. All we had to do is have a conversation, explain why, and we also talked about the demography in a way that there are a lot of young children and all of it, and we were able to kind of pull off a conversation, and in 6 months time we had something up and running. So I feel a lot of times we have this mindset that it's a slow process, it's tedious and all of that, and people care very little about these things. But if you have RWA, if you have a local layout where they have an association which is very willing to have these conversations, we've been able to get roads fixed. We had compliance for rainwater harvesting setups to be done for older apartments, which need not comply to the law because it was done at a phase which was almost 2 decades ago. We were able to achieve it because the conversation kept encouraging each one of us to find solutions in making it happen rather than look at reasons why wouldn't want a rainwater harvesting environment. So I think people have started believing that if you go spend some time, engage and explain your issues, though it might take a little longer to get things done, it is something that's acknowledged, and people have confidence, at least in this JP Nagar area, that the government is keen on bringing that change. And there is a WhatsApp group which is very active, so people will actually take pictures of say wires which are let loose because of the rains and other things which would cause friction, to little things that people notice. It's very participative in a way that somebody will just click the picture and say, I noticed this, but if the department could take action, it would be great. Then somebody will write a process saying that you should call this number or raise a complaint online on this, and it's just worked beautifully in our favor. And even the programs, Ritul, that we do for the corporators, which you're familiar with, we have seen that program go exponentially high in terms of numbers. And these are people who mostly speak Kannada. So the program we run is a combination with a little bit of local language inputs as well. And the stakeholder mapping and other things, they're able to appreciate and say, hey, we didn't actually think about frameworks and things to solve. Now that we've learned it, we'll go and implement it. And I've seen by the end of that program, they're able to come up with a presentation saying their ward has this much population, their challenges are this, these are the agencies that are working well in their favor, these are the hiccup points. So I think it's a lot to do with how much you want to engage with it and not look at it as government's problem and they are to solve.
Thank you, Soumya. That was an excellent response. Now that actually takes me to another tangent, which is that governance at the micro level, which is at the urban local body or panchayat level, is participatory by nature. That is through 73rd, 74th Amendment as well. But how do you make it participatory at a meta level, let's say union laws, wherein uh, is the government really listening? I mean, Antara, this is to you. Is the government really listening? Do they want to know what I think about India's marine policy?
Mhm. Sure. So first off, Soumya, more power to you. This is actually like, Soumya, I think you've hit at the heart of what I personally love about civic technology, right? One thing is that everybody thinks that it's some sort of fancy, space age stuff that we're working on, but no, really, it's as simple as leveraging a WhatsApp group for civic good. And it's just about breaking down those barriers and actually engaging with the state and seeing how rewarding that process is. And for that reward cycle to not just be limited to a few people, but to be extended to many. Right. So to answer your question, I think, and your earlier question about Samaj Sarkar and the urgency and local issues, I think that's the really powerful part about civic technology. It doesn't just have to be commenting on draft laws. You could build your civic muscle by engaging with some of the work that your corporation is doing through I Change My City. You could be on a WhatsApp group with your corporator, and that itself is a way of civic technology, right? And I think that's really like what excites me and actually engages me about the possibilities of technology. It's just the ability to break down those barriers and be able to engage and see the what incredible things that sort of engagement brings about. I'll control my excitement to come back to your second question, Ritul. Interesting point. So you're right. The current bills that have been put out in the public domain have a much shorter window. And Dave is also right in saying that compliance is not taking place at 100% level. However, what we have seen through our work is that the number of laws that have been put in the public domain for public consultation has increased almost 406% since 2014. A lot of these do comply with the 30-day PLCP guideline. However, they may not comply at the first instance. So I'll give you a quick example. There's currently a PWD law that the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment has put out. Initially, the law was put out with a very brief consultation deadline of 11 days. Now, the consultation has actually been extended, and the due date, if I'm not wrong, is 31st of August. So, if this podcast does come out in time, please go do share your feedback on these laws. They really do need your input. The government does have a way of doing things in which that they do tend to extend consultations after they come out. Another interesting part of this entire dilemma, right, Ritul, is the fact that one aspect is compliance and how much are we complying, right? And there we will always be left wanting, because even if we comply 99.99%, the 1% that we're not complying actually impacts the lives of so many citizens across the country. That's going to be a long standing process of evolution, and that's going to take time for us to bring about. What I do want to focus on, and what is actually something that is actionable to us today, is that in the laws that are complying, how much feedback are we giving? Are we able to get stakeholders' voices into the process? Are we actually able to show the government, demonstrate how effective this process is? And simultaneously, are we also able to demonstrate to the citizen how effective this process is? To my mind, that is something that we can actually work on with a lot more force, with a lot more energy, with a lot more exciting collaborations, and we can bring that about. That is one way of actually increasing the compliance needle to go from where it's at now to go a little bit deeper. And I'm happy to share some examples about real stories of real citizens whose feedback has been heard, and how that's actually had a role to play in the lawmaking process. Happy to do that if you'd like. But in essence, being very closely involved with the process day in and day out, we do see that there is a lot of cause for celebration as well. It's just a question of what is your strategic approach? Is the strategic approach to move the needle slowly, or is the strategic approach to perhaps look at something else till the government starts complying? And I think at CIVIS, at least, our sort of thinking has been that we can conduct that demonstration effect and actually move the needle towards greater compliance. And that'll only come if we actually show the value in engaging in the process.
All right, thank you, Antara. I wanted to ask you this towards the end of it, but I still want to know your thoughts. That what do you think could be the evolution in terms of the policy that can sort of aid this process? Do you think it should come with a statute, so it should be made mandatory that every law has to go through pre-legislative consultation stage? Or let's say a minister, while introducing the bill, has to present an addendum note with the details of pre-legislative consultation. How do you see that to be shaping, or do you want that to be shaping?
Right. So, Ritul, I think very interestingly, there have been a number of private member bills that have actually focused on pre legislative consultation. Supriya Sule, I think, in last year's monsoon session, had placed a private member bill to talk about pre legislative consultation, which actually outlines the consultation process building on national frameworks, which is the 2014 policy, as well as international guidelines like the OECD guidelines on consultative efforts and others. So, a statute push would definitely help a lot in terms of making sure that the laws are put out for consultation and with the 30-day window. The really challenging part, no matter who is undertaking this process, right, is being able to gather the input of the end stakeholder who's impacted by that law. To give you an example, there was a Rajasthan policy for one of the labor codes. As we know, the labor codes are undergoing a lot of overhaul. We actually had to engage with another nonprofit partner, Gramvani, which had networks in Rajasthan amongst daily wage earners and labor forces across the state. They had to record what we were saying in Hindi as a script and relate to their feet on street through a IVR based portal. The IVR portal was then responsible for gathering the responses, which we then translated into a report and then shared with the government. So, as you see, it's not easy to kind of mobilize this process. Statute does help, but at the end of the day, we need to have more people solving for these problems of actually getting the voice of the end stakeholder heard on the policy itself.
Thank you, Andra, again. I think of the list of my two final questions, one would be, are there precedents for such tech-enabled initiatives in governance in the international arena? I know a lot is happening in Africa on social innovation. Similarly, Taiwan has this whole IS platform, which is how citizens can express their stance on policy issues. How is the international landscape in this? Are there any successful precedents that we should look up to, or our listeners can go and read about?
Sure. So there's actually a lot of precedent and a lot of interestingly developing work. I would say I would pin the trajectory to almost at the time that a lot of the other internet led innovations, social media and others actually came about. One which is really close to home is, of course, Janagraha and their work, which is leveraging technology for public good. The others are, like you mentioned, Taiwan has Polis, and they also have Be Taiwan, which is now a part of the government functioning. We have in Brazil another platform that actually works on public petitioning. We have in the US a lot of interesting examples of people calling their senators and actually recording feedback or recording inputs on a particular law or policy and sharing it with their senators based on phone calls. In France, I think almost everything sort of goes under some amount of public scrutiny and debate. And it's not just national precedents which are cropping up all across the globe. A little bit of a spoiler, not spoiler alert here, but almost a cheat sheet. At CIVIS, we've actually published a report which chronicles all of these global moves towards participatory democracy using technology. So you can find that on our blog. But what has started to happen, which is quite interesting to me, is that it's not just restricted to the domain of the national, right? You had the World Economic Forum, which recently conducted a consultation on post COVID recovery. You have the COP21 deliberations, I think, if I'm not wrong, early in 2014-15, which were the ones which were the first exercise that I participated in to make sure that my voice was heard at an international delegation in France, right? So you're breaking down so many barriers. It's not just about the country and its ability now, it's about global collaboration that is being enabled through these processes. So there's a lot going on out there. And I think in some ways, we almost have to play catch up to the innovation which is happening globally.
Thank you so much. I think we've utilized all your time, and it's been a great learning for us, and both personally and I think to our listeners, that in the quest of being a better citizen, I think both civic tech, civis are ways that we should look forward to. Soumya, any parting thoughts? Divya, any parting thoughts?
No, I would say it's interesting that we had this conversation. Thanks, Antara and Divya, once again. I think the Takshashila alumni platform will give more conversations of such kind to the weeks to come, because we've been thinking about it, brewing about it. Ritul and I spoke for many months and we said, let's get started. So we are having this first conversation with you both, and it's nice the way we got started about things that matter to us, but we at times fail to see avenues to progress on it. And I think people who listen will definitely engage on your platform. So thanks for chatting with us.
Thanks, Soumya. Thanks, Ritul. I think it was really interesting, and Soumya, always happy to help in whatever way and form you need, even for the problems that you're solving for in JP Nagar. I don't stay in Bangalore, but if you need me to make posters or write letters, I'm to volunteer my time because it's incredible,
Now.
really.
Thank you so much, everyone. And now that, on a closing remark, now that you see what our alumni are doing, you have a great chance to become our alumni.
Yes.
Our courses are accepting applications for our GCPP, and Watching China program. So head to the website and you can take our course and be smart as everyone. Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.